Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Rob Blair. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. I'm also the coordinator of the Democratic Erosion Consortium. I'm here with Marissa Smith from Michigan State University and Liz Sperber from the University of Denver, who will be co-moderating this virtual roundtable on disinformation, media, and democracy. And we're delighted that so many of you could join us. So this roundtable was organized through the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a network of more than 60 universities in the US, UK, Ireland, Germany, Italy, Romania, Turkey, Israel, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. And as a consortium, our goal is to combine teaching and research and civic and policy engagement to help our students and faculty better understand threats to democracy, both in the US and abroad, and better address those threats through our work as students and educators and citizens. And our members run the gamut from small private liberal arts colleges to large public research universities. One of the centerpieces of the consortium is a course on democratic erosion that's taught at dozens of campuses every semester. Our faculty also use the consortium as a vehicle for producing research, for example, an ongoing impact evaluation designed to test strategies for reducing partisan polarization among American voters. We also use the consortium as a mechanism for engaging the policy community, including the US State Department, the National Democratic Institute, and a variety of other organizations. This is the fourth virtual roundtable that we've organized through the consortium. They've all been really terrific so far, and I'm very excited for this one. If you're an educator and are interested in joining the consortium, please email me or visit our website, democratic-erosion.com. So before we get rolling, I just want to briefly introduce Marissa and Liz. So Marissa Smith is an assistant professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations and the School of Journalism. And her research investigates news disseminated in digital environments and examines the socio-political influence of those messages. And specifically, her work highlights that a critical component for understanding the effects of digital information environments is the consideration of racial portrayals that saturate these online platforms. So through investigating the effects of racial portrayals on stereotype endorsement and public opinion, her work assesses the implications of digital information environments on democracy. Elizabeth Sperber is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Denver. She studies how new Christian movements in sub-Saharan Africa engage with processes of democratic consolidation or erosion. She also recently completed an experimental WhatsApp-based study of youth mobilization in Zambia's 2021 elections. Her research has won awards from the American Political Science Association section on politics and religion, and from both Columbia University and Brown University. As an active member of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, Liz also teaches about disinformation, technology, and democracy in comparative perspective, which is what led her to co-organize this panel. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Marissa and Liz.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I am going to start by introducing our panelists in alphabetical order. So first we have Kate Klonick. Kate Klonick holds a JD from Georgetown University and a PhD in law from Yale Law School. She is an assistant professor of law at St. John's Law School and affiliated fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute, and will soon serve as a visiting scholar at Harvard's new Rebooting Social Media Institute. Her research focuses on law and technology and has appeared in top law journals and public outlets from the Howard Law Review to the New Yorker and New York Times. We are thrilled to have her here. Next, we have Shannon Mcgregor. Shannon Mcgregor is an assistant professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a senior researcher with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, both at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research addresses the role of social media and their data in political processes with a focus on political communication, journalism, public opinion, and gender. Her published work examines how three groups, political actors, the press, and the public, use social media in regards to politics, how that social media use impacts their behavior, and how the policies and actions of social media companies in turn impacts political communication on their sites. Her work aims to bring insights about and new theories of emerging political communication and hybrid media and political systems. I will pass it to Liz.
Great, thank you. So I'll continue with our introductions to Brennan Nyhan, the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. His research, which focuses on misperceptions about politics and healthcare, has appeared in a variety of top journals across several academic disciplines, and he has been awarded prestigious fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Anti-Defamation League, as well as a major award from the American Political Science Association for his work on elections, public opinion, and voting behavior. Professor Nyhan is also a co-founder of Brightline Watch, a watchdog group that monitors the status of American democracy, and a contributor to the Upshot at the New York Times. We're delighted to have you. Magdalena Wojcieszak is a professor of communication at the University of California, Davis, and an associate researcher at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam. She has authored or co-authored more than 50 articles and is the associate editor of the Journal of Communication. She studies how people select political information and the effects of these selections on attitudes, cognitions, and behaviors. She also examines the effects of mass media and new information technologies on intergroup relations. She is also engaged in applying her work through academic partnerships with social media platforms, including work with Facebook to study how Facebook and Instagram affected political attitudes and behaviors in the US 2020 elections. And last but not least, we have Yunkang, a postdoctoral research scientist at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University, where he researches the flow of disinformation between state-sponsored foreign propaganda sites and domestic media sites in the United States. In 2020, he received his PhD in communication from the University of Washington, a leader in this field, with an award-winning dissertation on right-wing media in the United States. And I couldn't resist. A fun fact is that Yang was once a first runner-up in China's National English Debate Competition. So amazing. Thank you all for being here. I want to transition now to the first section of our talk today, where we thought we would just define a few key terms. So a very basic working definition of democracy for us today, and especially substantive liberal democracy, is a system of government in which people freely elect their representatives, and that representative government in turn is constitutionally constrained to respect individual rights, such as the right to free speech and freedom of assembly. Magdalena, we were going to turn to you next to ask you to help us define disinformation and misinformation, clarifying the distinction between those terms.
Absolutely, thank you. So that's the difference between these two terms is pretty murky for many people. So many observers, journalists, and academics ourselves sometimes use those terms interchangeably. But the difference between them concerns the intention of a user, essentially. So misinformation, by emerging, I would say, academic consensus, is information that's false, inaccurate, or misleading. And very importantly here, it can be created or spread mistakenly with no intention to deceive. So there are some findings by folks here that American social media users over 65 years old are most likely to spread unverified content on social media platforms. And it's probably unlikely that they really want to undermine American democracy by doing so. So it's mistake with no intention to deceive. And in turn, this information is false information, which is deliberately created and spread to mislead, to deceive, to influence public opinion, or obscure the truth. So for misinformation to be disinformation, there needs to be a clear intent to cause harm. But of course, on social media or online more generally, it's incredibly challenging, if not impossible, to assess one's intention. And also it's possible that information that was initially created to be harmful or to deceive with malicious intent can be later shared by users without such intent. So in short, as with everything that we do, it's pretty complex, but the definitional difference seems to be around intent.
Great, thank you so much. Kate, just a quick follow-up here. How do scholars and legal experts determine whether a claim is disinformation or misinformation?
Well, there's not really a clear, it's not as clear in the law as it is as kind of a sociological concept. There isn't actually like a very clear legal definition for this. And so as one of the things, and in particular, the First Amendment specifically protects your right to lie. There's been a wonderful, if you're interested in more kind of discussion of this and its impact on kind of this, the conversations around mis and disinformation, the Knight Institute at Columbia has been doing a wonderful series for the past couple of months and have a number of resources they put together about lying and kind of your right of free speech. But just generally, there isn't a legal definition for these types of concepts. They're more policy and political science and sociological definitions.
Great, thank you so much. And Yunkang, what is fake news, and how have scholars and journalists used the term used the term differently over time? Has the term migrated from origins associated with infotainment, for example, to something more malicious over time? And if so, what led to these changes?
Thanks for the question, Elizabeth. The term fake news has been widely used in popular conversations about problematic information. And as you know, most notably was used by Donald Trump and his allies, both in the political and media world, to attack the press. And scholars have been using this term too, to refer to false or misleading information published by dubious and usually for-profit websites. Many of these studies found limited exposure to fake news among the American population. For example, my esteemed panelist, Nyhan, and his colleagues published a study which shows that fake news websites made up a small share of people's information diets on average. And similar studies have found similar findings. I would say that some scholars have moved beyond the term of fake news to use misinformation and disinformation to describe the things that they study. And I think for me, I think there are two areas of research that have received relatively less attention in this particular line of work. The first area of research is visual misinformation. For example, misleading images and videos that spread on social media, such as Facebook. Because most studies on fake news, they define and operationalize fake news as links to untrustworthy web domains, websites. But social media users consume not only just articles, right? Not only just article URLs, but also images and videos. So my colleague, Matt Heinemann, Trevor Davis, and I completed a study on visual misinformation on Facebook during the 2020 election in the United States. And in the study, we analyzed a random sample of millions of political images, and we found that the level of visual misinformation is much, much higher. So I think this area has received less attention, but I think it deserves more attention. The second area of research that I think deserves more attention is influential media outlets that have journalistic trappings, yet publish an enormous amount of misinformation and disinformation. I think it is true that a relatively small percentage of Americans visited fake news, clickbait websites, but many, many more regularly consume Fox News and Breitbart, etc., which were usually excluded from the list of untrustworthy websites and domains used by scholars to estimate the scale of misinformation consumption. So in other words, these media outlets were treated as trustworthy news sources, right? And I think this is problematic So I'm not saying that Fox and Breitbart are fake news media, but I'm saying that they publish enormous amount of misleading information. So I think that any study that aspires to estimate the scale of misinformation consumption among American population should take that into account.
I just want to jump in and really echo both of those points Yunkang made about things that we're not focusing on as much, and share some recent data about sort of the scope of these other platforms that, or other websites that sort of share the trappings of news, but traffic in lots of disinformation. So with the Knight Foundation and Gallup, I advised them last summer on a 10,000 person survey that we did of Americans at like the intersections of technology and democracy. But one of the questions was just an open-ended question. What are the top 3 news sources that you rely on? Up to 3, and people could put it in. So with my amazing grad students, we took these like possible 30,000 some odd answers, and through a series of like computational and qualitative sort of meaning came to it with a schematic, and used the media bias fact check scale to look at like ideological extremity. And we see the asymmetry, you know, very little on the left, people saying that they're getting it from these sites, lots more on the right. And in fact, we were able to estimate that about 10% of the American public is putting in these hyper partisan far right news outlets. They're not selecting them from a list, they are entering them themselves. So we're talking about places like Epoch Times, Newsmax, OANN, far to the right even of things like Breitbart and Fox News. So I just wanted to add this sort of recent data point to show the scope of this problem.
Great, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to my colleague Marissa for the next section.
All right, sounds good. So now we're going to talk about situating or having a better understanding of the history of disinformation. So I want to start off with Shannon. So what would you help us situate the phenomenon of disinformation historically? We know that disinformation is not new. What are some of its historical antecedents, and how has our current world of disinformation evolved over time?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a wildly important question that we not ahistoricize this issue of disinformation. It seems like disinformation bubbled into our mainstream sort of public consciousness around the 2016 election, around efforts, you know, by foreign countries to interfere through Facebook sort of very specifically. And then this sort of rose to this concern. Millions of dollars of grants have been given to research this. Hundreds of panels such as this one, special issues of journals. This has received a lot of attention. I'm not criticizing that attention. I think it's good. I think it's really important that we recognize that there is no past in which everyone had the same sense of what was true and what was false. That is not a world that ever actually existed, especially if you take into account like differences of identity, right? When we're thinking about these things. And so terms like fake news and disinformation and inauthentic online behavior are somehow the things that are the only things responsible for this global far-right shift of populism. That's not true, of course, but when we ahistoricize these factors, I think it can contribute to that. And so one of the things, you know, that at our center, CTAP, that we've been doing, and in particular, I'll have to shout out my colleagues, Alice Marwick and Rachel Kuo and Shanice Cameron and Maura Weigel put together this critical disinformation studies syllabus. I cannot recommend it enough. It's fantastic. But in it, they go through, you know, several cases of disinformative campaigns, mostly focused in the US. So the case of crime and anti-Black disinformation, which has long been something in this country that has been covered by mainstream news outlets, pushed by governments. The case study of the welfare queen, right? And this sort of dominant narrative about how Black Americans were, you know, misusing government dollars, you know, to get high on the hog. This is a case of strategic racist disinformation. decades in our past. And so when we understand disinformation and the things we're talking about now with that rich history, it allows us to learn from those things. It allows us to narrow in into the things like how has changes in communication and technology shaped what disinformation looks like now as opposed to 40 years ago, right? And these are some of the really interesting, important questions. But if we evacuate history out of it, then we're not able to get to some of those same questions. And I think our analyses are certainly not as rich as a result of that.
Thank you so much for that wonderful feedback and wonderful elaboration. So next we have Magdalena. Magdalena, media scholar Kate Starbird argues that Twitter is quote unquote wired for disinformation. In your view, what are the most important aspects of today's social media technologies that facilitate the spread of disinformation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see what happens with Twitter, 3 to 6 months from now. So maybe that quote will become even more salient and pertinent. But yeah, as Shannon mentioned, false news, propaganda, misinformation, and so forth are not new at all. And it is incredibly important to have this historical perspective. But nevertheless, still like print and broadcast media in the US and elsewhere in the world have generally sustained the traditional journalistic norms of objectivity, of balance, of source checking, verification, and so forth. And so this kind of gatekeeping role of those traditional media kind of assured, or not assured, but was an important factor that increased the chances that the information that the public received was likely to be accurate. And when factual mistakes were made, they tended to be corrected. And as we know, again, kind of a platitude, but the internet has lowered the cost of entry to new competitors. And many of those new competitors have rejected those norms, either kind of explicitly or simply did not have the resources to verify information, to fact check, to engage in more investigative reporting. And then social media platforms have facilitated the spread, the very wide reach, and the speed with which misinformation becomes viral. So research shows that false information on Twitter spreads further and far more rapidly than true information. And this is especially the case when the topic is politics. And on social media, also false information can be shared by bots, which further increases its spread and reach. But actually that Twitter study found that it's actually humans who disseminate misinformation much more than bots. But it was again one study and only on fake news, and Yunkang mentioned. And also social recommendation algorithms, which predict engagement of content, can recommend unverified or otherwise problematic content to those who are most prone to engage with it or most susceptible to it. And also the emergence of kind of online homogeneous communities can further create those enclaves in which people who endorse misinformation can share it and engage with it even more. So many of those factors are absent in traditional media, even though of course many outlets now have to compete with for likes and engagements and shares, so also engage in kind of clickbaity and sensationalist reporting. And also it's very important to mention, kind of back to what Yunkang said, that it's the majority, a solid majority of the public doesn't contribute to that and doesn't inhabit those alleged online echo chambers, right? But nevertheless, those users who are incredibly democratically consequential, via January 6th, right, are those who are who take advantage of those affordances of social media to consume, to spread, to share, create, and so forth, unverified or false content.
Thank you so much. So I know your response with respect to spreading and affordances, you mentioned the ability to share fact-checking information as well. So I want to follow up with a question on that for Brendan. So Brendan, you have studied the rise and diffusion of fact-checking in journalism. Can you explain what you mean by fact-checking and say a bit about how and why political fact-checking is spreading across journalism?
Sure, thanks. So fact-checking is a journalistic movement that has developed a kind of new approach to political journalism that centers on the factual evaluation of a claim, usually but not always made by a political elite. There had previously been ad watch segments that were a kind of forerunner to the modern fact-checking movement, common in television news in the aftermath of the 1988. They were developed in the aftermath of the 1988 campaign when there was a perception that television coverage of the so-called Willie Horton ad had been a failure, that it amplified the false claims made in that ad. In the 90s and early aughts, that style of televised ad watch programming became more common. And then as the internet became available, different sorts of opportunities arose for how to assess the validity of the claims that were being made. Because of course, television ads are only one way in which people are exposed to misleading content about politics. So, there were different sorts of things out there. I was actually one of the founders of one of the original sites that did this online, but we were not journalists. And what really made this go was when journalists embraced it. So PolitiFact was the first mover here in tandem with the factcheck.org at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and later the Washington Post fact checker. So starting in the late aughts, continuing on, these websites began to systematically apply the principles of journalism, but in a different way. Instead of trying to summarize a factual debate, which often led to a concern that these news reports were presenting matters of fact as disputes between equally valid claims, they changed the structure of stories to make it about the evaluation of the claim that was foregrounded, and there was no artificial balance imposed on the judgment that was reached. Those articles of that type have now become quite widely disseminated. I think in 2016, we found more than 1 in 4 Americans visited one of those sites in the period before the 2016 election. So quite widespread. Tiny percentage of people's information diet, though. So when you think about how they matter, this is the last thing I'll say. So they've disseminated quite widely. Their fact checking is now practiced not just all over the United States, but around the world. And there are people thinking about different models of fact checking. There's so-called second generation fact checkers in other countries who try to not just publish fact checks, but influence the practices of elites in a more direct way than we've typically seen from American fact checkers. But when it comes to how this is influencing people more generally, I would say it's not just direct contact with the content itself. It's the watchdog feature of fact checking in holding political elites accountable, which in turn can be repeated and disseminated in mainstream media coverage that reaches vastly more people, as well as by opposing campaign ads. So that helping to shape the incentives of politicians, I think, is an important feature of fact checking. It's also helping to reach many more people, as I suggested, through the media coverage it influences. So reporters who in the past did not trust their own judgments in an area in which they were not expert as to whether a particular claim they'd encountered was false can now cite those claims with some confidence. They're not perfect, but they know someone has done a deep dive on a factual question of interest, and they can cite that and be confident that that judgment will stand up. So I think in that way, the fact checkers have reached many more people than their direct reach would suggest.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question related to that for Shannon. So Shannon, you have done work distinguishing what you term the quote unquote informational ideal of a citizen in a democracy from our current democracy of identity appeals. Can you share a bit about some of this work? What are the takeaways for students and students of democratic erosion?
Yeah, thank you. So for a long time, the sort of informational elements of democracy have animated communication research, political science research, right? through the lens of this like progressive era ideal of the information-based citizen, which, you know, provides simultaneously a very nice normative and empirical understanding of democracy that's deeply embedded in our public thinking about what it looks like to be a citizen in a democracy, but also in our academic thinking, right? We're here talking about disinformation, right? So information is really central to what we think about in all of this. But in recent years, political scientists have advanced a really robust and new empirical understanding of democracy, primarily around identity-based terms, such that political campaigns may be really more about reminding voters of their partisan identities, which then mobilizes them to go support their group at the polls. And information is sort of secondary to those partisan identity appeals. So with my colleagues, Daniel Kreis and Regina Lawrence, we have called this, the practice of this in campaigns, political identity ownership, you know, where candidates and parties attempt to communicate different social groups that align with their parties and make, you know, important in-group and out-group sort of appeals through identity, which definitely gets to some of the visuals that Yunkang was talking about earlier. But this is a really different type of a democracy. So in thinking about what different types of citizens we've had in a democracy, you know, there's another era that we have, which was a democracy of partisanship. This is an era sort of right after the Civil War, where voting was seen less as you took information and made a decision, but you were expressing your partisan loyalty through the polls, right? And I would say that it seems to me like we are pretty firmly back into a democracy of partisanship. But our institutions, including the public, are acting like we live in a democracy of information. So we live in this democracy now where individuals think that they are and must be informational citizens. They have all that information, right? It's at our fingertips all the time. But they're more acting like the citizens in sort of the mid to late 19th century, where voting was the statement of affiliation. And so I think this really matters because we have to attend to what it means to live in a democracy where our institutions are set up around this ideal of an informational citizen that doesn't reflect our political reality. So if we want to deal with democratic backsliding and attacks on equity and justice, including the role of social media platforms and all of this, then I think we must take really seriously the notion that people are making political decisions, including voting, but also illiberal actions like the attacks we see on nonpartisan election workers as things that are driven by carefully constructed notions of political identity. And so all of these constructions of identity involve creating outgroups and in-groups and moral claims. Some are anti-democratic in that they restrict to seek power from outgroups and will go to violent ends to do so. So thinking meaningfully about what it means to be an identitarian citizen in a democracy, I think helps us understand what is really, or what is contributing a lot to fueling democratic backsliding and democratic erosion in the US, but I think in many other democracies as well. I can just speak most to this case because I am an Americanist. But I think, you know, thinking about what that means and what does an identitarian citizen mean in a democracy can help us unpack this democratic backsliding that we in so many other countries are dealing with.
All right, thank you so much, Shannon. So I'm also monitoring the Q&A so we can integrate that in as well. So I do have one that I want to integrate in now, and the other ones we will make sure we come to before the end, but it's a follow-up to Shannon's response of, would you say that we were not ever not in a democracy of partisanship?
I'm getting to my unmute button. I think to a certain extent, it was less partisan, right? There was this very big shift even of partisan affiliation right after the civil rights movement, in which it was people were voting on information around ideals, certainly also still around identity, but there was such shifts that I don't know that we were as firmly in voting in sort of a partisan style of democracy where it was simply about affiliation. And then I also think, you know, in the pre-civil rights era, there was a pretty homogenous electorate, right? After the failed Reconstruction and before the Civil Rights Movement, Black Americans were routinely disenfranchised from the ballot box and from other aspects of the democracy. So it seemed like a less partisan time because it was a more homogenous group of actual voters and political actors. But I think that's a really great question because, of course, all of this is on a spectrum, right? It's not like we're just all of a sudden in one different model tomorrow, right? Because of something that happens.
All right, thank you so much. Be prepared to take yourself off of mute one last time, Shannon. So now we want to switch and talk about targeting, specifically with respect to disinformation. So Shannon, your colleagues at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, specifically Dean Freelon, could not be here with us today, but he and others have studied the targeting of disinformation to different populations. So what are some of the most important findings in this body of work, and what do they portend for the future of democratic participation?
Yeah, I think this is a really crucial, in general, targeting is a really crucial way for us to understand sort of the impact of any type of information, including disinformation, as it's shared across platforms, because this is, of course, one of their features, right? That they can target different and smaller and very sort of homogenous groups of folks. This is the product, in effect, right, that they have, is the ability to do this. And so we can't understand the content that we're studying of disinformation. We can't understand the intent necessarily, right, to Magdalena's definition in the beginning, unless we understand the content and the targeting, right? And who is it from? All those three pieces must be there for us to have a robust understanding of what is really going on in this space. Of course, some of the targeting data is on a scale of hard to impossible to get because it's behind proprietary walls at places such as Facebook. What the research by my colleagues Dean Freelon and others like Young-Mi Kim at the University of Wisconsin have found that social platforms, including Facebook, but also others, have been used to target voters with, in particular, voting disinformation along racial identity lines and other lines of identity that either dissuade those from going to the polls, sharing misleading information about this, and attempting to create, using disinformation, rupture within cohesive communities along lines of racial identity, in particular among Black Americans in the US. And I also want to say, shout out to my other colleagues at UNC, Daniel Kreese, and our graduate students, Bridget Barrett and Madhavi Reddy, who wrote a piece about the need for race-conscious platform policies in thinking about protecting democracy, and why knowing about targeting is so important, and in fact, not having race-neutral policies. So they argue against race-neutral policies, and they say, to take an example, running targeted ads to whites who interacted with racist content should in theory run counter to Facebook's policies, while targeting Black Americans to promote voting should be encouraged, according again to their own policies. But by failing to distinguish between these two things, because they have a race-neutral policy, then we have to consider the democratic ends of that content that's being targeted, right? And so the impacts of this, we have to look at it from an ends, not an ends neutral perspective, right? And this means having race-conscious policies that take into the fact that much of the disinformation that we see is targeted around racial or other identity lines.
All right, thank you so much. I have a quick follow-up question, and this is open to anyone on the panel. Can anyone speak to, we've talked about who is being targeting, but can anyone speak to or say more about who does the targeting? So in other words, who are the strategic actors and what are the platforms and mediums through which they target?
Marissa, can I jump in?
Yes, go ahead.
So I'll be a little bit of the targeting skeptic here. This panel's agreed with each other way too much. And I love all my colleagues, but we'll learn more if we draw this out. So let me just make the case. Targeting is going to be most direct when it comes to advertisements, but that's really a small share of what you're exposed to on Facebook or other platforms. There are, of course, algorithms that are affecting what you're seeing, but that's relatively complex because, of course, you're choosing whom to follow, and that's shaping what it's called inventory is available for the algorithm to show you. So the targeting framework becomes much more complex and diffuse in those cases. I think there are very serious questions that Shannon's absolutely putting on the table as far as ad policies at Facebook with regard to targeting. But I'll just say, I think we sometimes focus on micro-targeting too much to the exclusion of the broader questions in this domain. Again, because it's such a small share of the information flows on these platforms, and because there really isn't strong evidence that micro-targeting enhances persuasive effects in the way that some people assume. Now, there are other cases like what Shannon's pointing to, where we just say it's facially problematic to target in that way, full stop, right? It's not about persuasive effects. But many other people have understood the micro-targeting debate to be about massive effects because I know who you are. And there's just no evidence of that. Cambridge Analytica was snake oil. It did not, they had no magic voodoo. I don't think anyone on this panel disagrees with that. But I want to make sure the audience really hears us say that. So when it comes to targeting, actually, what I would say is I'm actually worried about we talked a little bit about earlier, like I think Shannon was saying, she got 10% of people who are following these, self-reported following these very extreme folks. Magdalena alluded to this kind of, minority of people who consume extreme, who have kind of extremist information flows. And I think when we're thinking about harms, we might just think about people who have really skewed information flows. And I think sometimes the model is more about algorithms and targeting driving that. And I would say the evidence is more, it's not to say there aren't problems in those areas, but the evidence is more consistent with people, a small minority of people, far fewer than many assume, but a small minority of people having a strong preference for these very biased information flows. Those people consume, they're a small minority of the population, but they consume a lot of the most problematic content. And they in turn induce supply from various politicians and grifters and fringe media outlets to provide content that they favor. And so you can get, the people who are getting the most strongest exposure to misinformation or disinformation, if you prefer that term, are going to be these small minorities of folks who are often opting into these information flows in various ways. There may be aspects of the way these systems work that are enhancing the exposure levels, but fundamentally, it's often because they actually find that kind of information congenial. And in some ways, that's a harder problem. And this is the last thing I'll say, because I want to let my colleagues weigh in. But that's a much harder problem because targeting makes it seem easy. Like the platforms can just turn a knob and the problems we worry about will go away. And again, that's been an assumption in the discourse for the last 4+ years. This is, people don't have these preferences as such. It's the targeting that's driving it. I don't think anyone on this call is saying that, but that notion is out there. And I think it's a much harder problem that this is content people, a small minority, but nonetheless, content that some people really want. And we have to decide where the boundaries are as far as allowing for the free flow of that information on these platforms, which are not governed by the First Amendment, but where we nonetheless have concerns we want to balance about the free flow of information. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So to follow up with this conversation, we have a question from the audience. This is open to Shannon, Brendan, or anyone else on the panel. Is there evidence that certain voters are more responsive or susceptible to targeted misinformation? Just because some people may be targeted with certain messages doesn't mean that they are more persuaded by it.
I mean, I can start with this a little bit. And I think that like part of this is that we don't have mass persuasion effects in general across any type of advertisement or content or anything. Like people just really aren't that movable. In theory, the people who are most movable in terms of being persuaded along political ends are people who don't have a lot of political information, are not very politically interested, are not participating. Those people are like almost not targetable, right? Because of like the ways in which we target folks, using sort of the different interfaces are less likely to even be sort of targeted, certainly not in some homogenous way. Instead, if we think though, in terms of, the audience question about, are they more responsive or susceptible to targeted misinformation? What we do know is that any information, whether it's true or false, if it affirms your priors, then you are more likely to welcome it in whether you're, reading the content, engaging with it, sharing it, etc. So if it, aligns with your worldview, then you're more likely to, engage with that content, accept the information in it, whether it's true or false. that's not a social media issue. That's just like a human psychology issue, right? So anyway, I will let other folks weigh in on that, but that's a great question from the audience.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that audience question? All right, so we have another follow-up in the area of like audiences and who are susceptible, who may or may not be susceptible. So Yunkang, your award-winning dissertation, now a book project, has examined disinformation flows in the US right-wing media sphere. What are some of your key findings in this work? To what extent and why are right-wing media outlets such as Fox News or Breitbart particularly susceptible to this type of disinformation?
Thanks, Marissa, for the question. I'm happy to share some of the findings of a book project that I just completed. So my book on US right-wing media relies on a data set that is both broad and narrow. It is broad in the sense that it includes the full text of every online article published by approximately 40 major right-wing media outlets, including Fox, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Daily Wire, etc., between 2017 and 2020. The data set is also narrow because it has the Facebook engagement data for each article, the number of likes, shares, comments, and reactions, which allows me to sift through millions of articles and focus on the ones that were actually engaged by online audiences. So a key finding of the book is that disinformation was a key feature of the most prominent topics that audiences engaged with in the right-wing media sphere between 2017 and 2020. Almost every right-wing media outlet spread high-profile disinformation stories, such as the Obama wiretap story in 2017 and the Nunes memo story in 2018. And you ask why Fox or Breitbart are particularly susceptible to disinformation. I think sometimes they manufacture disinformation themselves. In a book chapter that I wrote with my co-author Lance Bennett, we found that Fox News was actively providing disinformation to the Trump White House in 2020 during a COVID outbreak. And of course, in other cases, it can go into the other direction. Right-wing media sometimes pass on disinformation, amplify this disinformation on behalf of Republican elites and pass it on to their audiences. And still in other cases, propaganda involves going to both directions. So it involves interaction and coordination between government officials and their media allies, especially during the Trump administration. So this is quite different from this more conventional top-down propaganda model in the United States, where politicians used to sell policies to much of the US media. So we believe that this represents something new, something quite different. We call it interactive propaganda to kind of put more emphasis on the role of media elites like Fox News and Breitbart in co-producing and manufacturing and amplifying disinformation.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who is going to start with the next section of questions.
Thank you so much. So now we wanted to shift just for a minute to thinking more explicitly about international or comparative dynamics. So Magdalena in particular, we know that you've studied media exposure and political polarization in the context of the EU. And we wondered if you could summarize some of your key findings and assess what factors, if any, may differentiate this relationship in the context of the EU as opposed to that of the United States.
Absolutely, thank you. So in my European Research Council grant ERC Expo, we examined the dynamics of online exposure and the effects of those online exposures. And we collected survey self-reports on numerous factors, attitudes, behaviors, misperceptions, and so forth over 9 months. So 3 waves every 3 months. And we pair those data with very detailed online behavioral traces from the same participants collected using our open source tool, Web Historian, that allows for transparent data sharing. So essentially it accesses users' browser history already stored on their computer and allows them to submit the data to researchers after reviewing the data using nice interactive visualizations. So in total, we have 27 months worth of online browsing, about 120 million visits from about 7,000 people in 3 countries. And we studied the US, Poland, which is another interesting democratic backsliding case, and the Netherlands. And we created extensive open source lists of news domains in each country. So Shannon, we had, kind of going back to your initial point about the work that you did, we had about 5,000 different domains that were categorized as news. And we also developed classifiers to identify political content within news domains, outside, a classifier which we're still improving, which actually speaks to what some of you have mentioned, that identifies content about misinformation in news articles as well, and so forth. So some key findings, which I think the core one is incredibly important to put in perspective what we are discussing, is that news consumption, and again, we had those 5,000 plus lists in the US, many fewer, but still robust and very extensive for the European countries. So news consumption is dramatically limited, dramatically. So on average, only 3.4% of visits in our data sets comprised visits to news sites. And surprise, surprise, we find greater news consumption in the European countries. So in Poland and the Netherlands, it was about 4%. In the US, it was 2.4%. And also a solid majority of those visits were not to hard news. So again, people go to all those websites, Fox, CNN, wherever, for sports, for recipes, for weather. So only between 14 and 36% of those visits to news domains were to hard news or content classified as political using our classifier. And we had a very big, broad definition of what sociopolitical is. And speaking to polarization, in the US, only about 1% of overall browsing was to partisan news. And again, we included, we had the ONN, Shannon, we had the Breitbart, and so forth and so forth. And again, in online browsing, that the data that we had, which importantly excluded mobile, we didn't have access to mobile browsing, but only 1% of all the visits were to partisan news domain. And we found in one of our studies that kind of within subjects, overtime exposure to partisan news, whether from the left, from the right, congenial, counter-attitudinal, actually had no effects on attitude or affective polarization. And other kind of preliminary, not yet published analyses from Poland and the Netherlands also suggest that this is the case. So kind of simply news, and especially hard news, are a very small drop of an overall ocean of content of what people do online and see online. And partisan news are even a smaller drop. And there are some other studies that also have mobile and also find kind of similarly low percentages. This is kind of pretty, I would say, robust across different similar studies. And also we have some high-level findings regard misinformation. So again, in the US, very consistent with past work, exposure to untrustworthy sites, and we use the kind of now older but frequently used list by Alcott and colleagues. Is very limited and also has no overtime effects on political misperceptions in the US. And kind of what's interesting is that we find that much greater percentage of people's exposure are to content, or maybe not much, but to people are exposed to the coverage of misinformation more frequently than to untrustworthy sources in our data. So this kind of secondhand indirect exposure to misinformation through, legacy or mainstream or even partisan media is more frequent than exposure to misinformation. And then also in the kind of interestingly, there are no parallel lists for untrustworthy sources in the 2 European countries that we studied, which kind of anecdotally suggests that this issue is not as widely researched, and perhaps, especially in the Netherlands, not as salient or pressing as it is in the US. And in Poland, the kind of the list that we've started creating also suggests that those untrustworthy sites cannot be kind of neatly categorized into left and right. So this is, I believe, kind of a unique feature of the American misinformation ecosystem, or untrustworthy sites ecosystem, right? That there is a clear ideological divide, which is not the case in Europe, based on our, again, very preliminary work in this area. Yes, and of course, right, better funded education, multi-party system, apart from, in contrast to two-party system, and stronger public service broadcasting are, of course, all factors that are absolutely crucial in thinking about why the US is different, and it is, and that's kind of important to keep in mind. And also, but I also want to mention that all academic work that we've done here that relies on online panels of respondents, who take part in academic research, who share their online behavior with academics, are incredibly unlikely to include people that we are most interested in, right? That those who are most likely to endorse misinformation or spread it or create it, and those most extreme. So again, those folks simply do not join online panels and are unlikely to submit their online browsing for academic research. So different approaches are needed to actually kind of get at these questions of prevalence and effects among the most susceptible and consequential populations.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for touching on these methodological issues as well. It's important and interesting. So I want to move now, because we're almost running low on time. I'm going to skip ahead to ask Kate some questions about "quote unquote" big tech and the law and content moderation, which recent news from Elon Musk has made even more salient today than it was a week ago. So Kate, some argue that the regulatory and legal tools that could be applied to combat disinformation potentially violate the right to free speech. In your view, or the view of other legal experts, what are the most promising legal avenues to try to address disinformation on social media today?
Yeah, I would say that specifically it's not, the right to free speech. It would be like if there was going to be some type of violation, or the thing that keeps us from regulating mis and disinformation in the United States is specifically the First Amendment, which I had said before kind of covers and protects your right to lie, frankly. And just if you're interested in kind of excellent kind of work on this, Jeff Kosif has a book coming out that is, he has a recent book called The United States of Anonymous, which discusses anonymity and the role that it plays in free speech and being able to spread mis and disinformation in part, and it's wonderful. But he's also working on a book about your right to lie and kind of the false notion of kind of the quip about fire in a crowded theater. But just generally speaking, I will say that the main things that I think that we're talking about today are, again, not necessarily ones that have legal solutions. They are ones that that target specifically kind of what you're saying or the truthfulness of it. This is, reasonable minds are always going to differ, have differed. And as Shannon excellently pointed out, the real harms to these come when they perpetuate fraud or discrimination against minority communities. I tend to be actually to join Brendan in throwing a disagreement monkey wrench into the conversation. I tend to disagree a little bit with kind of a lot of the hysteria or kind of sky is falling kind of calamity that has happened and we've seen in the last couple of years around social media's role in mis and disinformation. I do think that it absolutely makes speech cheaper. I think it makes speech faster. I think it makes it easier for it to spread. But I do think that there have been, and I posted it I will post it in the chat when I'm done talking, but Josh Tucker at NYU has been doing some amazing work on this. And it's specifically pushing back against kind of how bad is this problem and how ahistorical, to use Shannon's word, is this problem. And I don't think it's particularly historical. A lot of these assessments and these ways that we judge truth we don't need to actually get into epistemological conversations. We don't need to ban certain types of, we don't need to kind of try to even we can enable more fact checking, as Brendan talks about. We can strengthen journalistic institutions. And those are all kind of sociological and political, small p political solutions to these types of things. We can strengthen voting rights. But generally speaking, I just don't actually think that that things are quite as nefarious as we think, and that this is quite as huge idea and a problem. We've had this type of issue with mis and disinformation and its effects on democracy happen every time there's some huge change in communications infrastructure and its availability, its widespread availability to people, when there have been changes in the printing press, when there have been changes in media and television, when there have been changes in cable broadcasting, when there were newspaper wars in major markets. So there are plenty of examples of this. But I just generally think that the best way to fix social media, full stop, is around shoring up things that we know are good for democratic institutions and information institutions in general, which are that we want types of transparency so that people can make judgments themselves. We want to know what's going into things and where these lines are being drawn and what we're seeing and what we're not seeing. And we want to be able to kind of have some type of pushback on what the infrastructure is that we're engaging in, or to have options and choices in order to be able to choose between the different kinds of markets of rules or the markets of governance that we're engaging with on these different platforms that are controlling our speech. The difficulty with this, of course, is just that you run headlong into First Amendment concerns in the United States. You run into, as we're seeing right now at Twitter, that there is nothing different in the Elon Musk kind of Twitter scenario happening that hasn't been happening for the last 15 or 20 years, in which you have a small group of social media tech elites in Silicon Valley making rules for everyone else and instituting those and kind of colonializing the world with kind of US principles of kind of free speech and absolute speech, a kind of exceptionalism. But what you have now is kind of what the Musk kind of controversy shows us is that we've been in a what is water type of scenario in which we don't even realize what we're swimming in. And we're finally kind of reaching this point where the Musk kind of shakeup makes us realize exactly what we're swimming in and how bad it is and how fragile the system that we've built for it. And so if there's anything, I would say putting, not to thump a kind of typical legal professor type of thing, but kind of more procedure, more transparency, and then building those types of things in rather than trying to really target or respond to any specific historic moment or a sense of things being fatalistic or substantively needing to be substantively addressed.
Great, thank you. In a way, you're presaging the latter set of questions where we were going to try to look for something hopeful. On that note,
that's not usually my beat, but I'll take it.
Changed a lot in college. Just kidding. Brendan, I think you had a follow up. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I've learned a lot from Kate and her colleagues in this area on the legal issues, and I'm no lawyer, but I've learned enough to be very worried about the kind of grand pronouncements people make about Section 230. And how simple it will be to get rid of that and how they'll fix all of our problems. And I think audiences like this aren't pushed enough on what they think the outcome would be of a British style system with aggressive adjudication of truth claims and the ability to silence people by burying them under expensive legal bills. People should think really carefully about what they want here. I think there's been a lot of rash and poorly justified claims. And I would just submit that I think we should be very reticent for all the reasons that are obvious about trying legal solutions to the problem of misinformation as such, because it is inherent to a free society. I just want to hammer the point Kate was mentioning. You have the right to lie under the First Amendment. And in fact, I will submit that a society without misinformation is not a free society, full stop. We are not going to get rid of this, nor should we aspire to. And so when we think about policy solutions, we have to think about which balance these competing values most effectively. And so I've really been persuaded in learning about this that other kinds of approaches, rather than targeting the misinformation directly as a matter of law and policy, are going to be more fruitful. So the transparency and data access provisions in the Coons-Portman bill are a great path because they create opportunities for stakeholders in the media to bring scrutiny to the choices the platforms are making, but without the risk of these legal burdens being imposed, without government being directly involved in what's allowed to be published or circulated. Similarly, there's a Klobuchar bill on content neutral frictions. That's another way to change how social media works. It's content neutral. It's not specific to the kind of content, including misinformation. And Paul Romer has a proposal for a progressive tax on online ad revenue that I think is really interesting because it changes the business model equation. Right now, the folks inside the companies who are working really hard to address these issues are often losing those arguments because of the economic incentives they face. And to the extent that greater and greater ad revenue is the path forward for their businesses, it's very hard to win those arguments. But in a world where the tax rate ratchets up as those revenues get higher and higher, of course, it might change those conversations. And again, those are indirect ways to promote the kind of values we think are important, but without taking the risk of British-style silencing of dissent, and without taking the risk of the government being involved directly in adjudicating what's true or false.
Thank you. Those are really, really important points. Shannon, I think you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that I completely agree with what the points Kate is making and Brendan is making. And I wanted to add to it that if, we're here in this conference brought together by, we're looking at democratic backsliding, democratic erosion, right? If what we're concerned about is preserving democracy, and we're concerned about the role of misinformation in it, I would also proffer that misinformation is much less of a problem when we think about the existing institutional inequities that we have in this democracy and in others, and how fragile, as Kate mentioned, those institutions, it turns out, are, right? And so I think that one of the reasons misinformation has become subject to so much public attention is because, frankly, it is a lot nicer to think that we got to this moment that we're in our democracy because people were duped by social media posts into voting for a racist authoritarian. It is much more complicated to think about how groups of people think to support someone like that, and also how the institutions that could and should have put some sort of reins around the authoritarian move of the right in this country have again and again and again failed to do so. That is a much more unpleasant conversation. It is a hard conversation to have, and there are not easy answers to it. However, I do think that's the conversation that we should be having. Of course, mis and disinformation play a part in that, right? Like that is how some of these goals are furthered, how people are motivated to participate. So it's not as if it's not a concern, but it's downstream of the democratic decay and the lack of strength of institutions to shore up democracy, all of which, is faltering because we have these existing inequities in our society.
I just want to add something really quick, which is I think that to Brendan's point about Section 230, to Shannon's point about kind of the idea that these are institutional concerns, and that, but I really want to the law is just a lot less than you think it is. As a general concept, just like math is less than you think it is. It is far less of a normative prescription or any type of thing than you want it to be, or that it actually is. And that in fact, it is operates, most of reality in life operates in the shadow of these things and cannot be constrained by law necessarily. And there's we could get into a giant philosophical conversation about that. But setting that aside, I just want to say that when you have these kind of one of the best ways to think about this is in the context of speech and lies, because specifically we have certain protections for freedom of speech because governments have screwed it up so often and constrained individuals and censored them and used force and used power to actually to undermine the small d democracies that we've been talking about all day. And so going to the law going to states and saying, here states, like, yes, I want you to be the one controlling our freedom of speech, we know that that doesn't work, right? So this is like, it is a very kind of short-sighted, I think, it is a very short-sighted, I think, like trying to skip a step, right? Which is like the step that's important and the thing that we like about the rule of law, the thing that we are trying, what I think people feel when they say intuitively that they want the law to solve for these problems is they feel disempowered by corporations that they can't control and have no accountability to. And so they know that they have accountability with government. So they want government to come in and hold these corporations accountable. But we know that government is also a problem when it comes to speech and is in fact beholden to us. So like the difficulty in that is like just handing the reins to government to decide, let's do this, like get rid of misinformation, why can't we just ban misinformation or disinformation or anything else? It's actually just like it's just like a panacea. It is just completely, it's a fiction, right? All of this at the end of the day has to be about democratizing these institutions that right now are basically privately and publicly held in the sense that they are corporations that are held by private individuals that are not government. And so I think that is the main kind of interesting point to be taking from all of these conversations at the moment. And I think that, the current like news of the past 24 hours does a great job of highlighting that.
Great, thank you. I think, in the democratic erosion class, we spend most of the other weeks on the kind of institutional questions and little d democratic questions that you all were pointing us back to. And this is a good opportunity to refer anyone in our audience actually back to other roundtables that we've had with folks who are directly studying the issues of, why and to what extent are political parties not constraining their, demagogue candidates, et cetera. But the points that you're all making now, I think, are obviously really, really important points, even though they may be somewhat surprising to folks to think about when we try to understand disinformation and its role and the scope of its role in our present predicament. So I appreciate that. I'm going to weave in an audience question here that's actually specific to Brown to some degree, but we have the question: Brown's president just last week announced the finalization of a policy that the university will not do business with organizations that support science disinformation, including climate change. This includes contracts, gifts, and grants. Is this true that this is the first time in the country? Does anyone know? And perhaps more interestingly, do you think this is a helpful effort in the attempts to try to mitigate disinformation more broadly? This is to anyone.
I have no idea if this is the first time at all, but I do think, there is precedent, as Kate was just mentioning, these are things that are dealt with by corporations that we don't have government control or government responsiveness around. So, if we want to not just rely on our, techno overlords to make the right decisions or nice ones, the other thing that we can do is make sort of business or economic movements against, right, these issues. And we saw some of this, with advertisers pulling off of Facebook before they took down Trump's platform sort of there. Those got some attention at the time in terms of like public attention and media. I don't know that they were effective necessarily in fundamentally changing the landscape, but it's certainly a different approach to be trying to address some of these things. But I would love to hear, what others think about this sort of like economic boycott approach to tackling this.
I'm a little concerned. I don't know what this means for academic freedom. I would be interested to hear what people think about that. Like, I actually think that this is kind of damning for academic freedom. And like, it's completely up to Brown. I mean, alum 06 with Liz over here. Sorry. But it's completely up to Brown to do this. This is like well within its discretion. Whether this, and like maybe it is a use. There's been also talk about having a lot of Harvard or Yale or a lot of these massively endowed institutions to like have them kind of take remove from their endowment structure like stock in all of these companies or things like that. But like, I don't know how that tips into academic freedom, and to the extent that it does kind of create a chilling effect for people to study these phenomena, whether, you know, and to have, you know, and to go in with no priors, I think that that's a little bit dangerous.
It's certainly going to be an awkward look when they're bringing in speakers, right, and saying you should listen respectfully to people across the political spectrum. But by the way, Brown won't do business with anyone, you know, on the right side of the climate debate, right? That's it's awkward. It's awkward. It's a complex issue. I don't have an easy answer, but we should think about all the manifestations of it. And yeah, I think you're right to think about academic freedom. I can imagine certain kinds of research projects or affiliations that people might have might also get entangled in this.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Could I pop in just quickly? So also as a Brown alum, but also a Brown faculty member, I mean, I think one of the really tricky questions that this poses is where you draw the line, right? So this is a question that somebody asked in the Q&A a while back, right? Where exactly do you draw the line between, you know, peddlers of disinformation and peddlers of perspectives that you disagree with, even if you disagree with them vehemently? You know, it is hard to distinguish in some cases. And I think, Brendan, to the last point that you raised, I think one additional complexity here is the sort of scaffolded way in which a lot of donors operate, for example. So you might have, you know, the Koch brothers giving money to some other organization, which in turn gives money to some other organization, which in turn provides a postdoc that a grad student has, right? Or you know, or a small grant that somebody uses to fund a conference. So the question is, okay, is there like an original sin there where we say, you know, that postdoc or that small grant is tied in some inextricable way, you know, to the Koch Foundation, or, you know, are there sort of degrees of separation where we say, okay, this is no longer, you know, such a concern? I don't know how this is going to play out in you know, in practice, but I think it's going to be certainly a thorny issue for Brown to try to resolve.
Great. Any other comments on this? Okay. Kate, to move on to something a bit sexier, if I may say, you were able to embed yourself as a researcher in Facebook, which allowed you to do things like interview Mark Zuckerberg and members of Facebook's internal oversight board. You have a great piece about this in the New Yorker, in addition to pieces in law reviews. And drawing on a student from one of my questions in, one of my students in my democratic erosion class at DU, I was wondering if you could sort of summarize some of your observations about how this internal solution came about and how you think it's functioning.
Yeah, well, it came about basically because, in kind of a very not democratic way, somebody knew Sheryl Sandberg, specifically Noah Feldman, who is a Harvard Law School professor, and you know, from going to college together and having those types of connections. And he basically pitched this idea. It was something that a lot of stakeholders had pushed for a very long time, and so it had a lot of buy-in among kind of the factory floor of people at Facebook, and it had to get buy-in from kind of the C-suite, so to speak. And eventually it did. And then I think eventually, basically, it was pitched to Zuckerberg as an idea of it would create like a scapegoat for all of these really terrible content moderation decisions and free speech choices that he didn't want to be in charge of making anymore. That hasn't exactly been what's happened. In fact, there's a lot of kind of let's just contrast it with the Musk thing today, which is just, generally speaking, I think that now we know that they're all just kind of dictators, but now it makes Mark Zuckerberg look a little bit like kind of a benevolent dictator that's trying to devolve his power in some type of way, versus kind of this very nepotistic kind of take from Musk, which is like, I don't like the speech that's here, I'm going to buy it, and I'm going to, you know, publish the speech that I want to publish and censor the people I want to censor, and that'll be it. And so I think that there's that has been, you know, that project and watching it happen was, I think, a fascinating moment in time. I don't know that there is going to be the type of pressure that Facebook was uniquely under from a public relations standpoint to really force any other company to do this again. But it is becoming kind of, this is where regulation actually can come in. They can like countries and can get together and force companies to have this type of accountability or transparency measure. And I think it might increasingly be a formula that is successful going forward.
Great, thank you. A brief follow-up on this from another student, actually. So when you're sitting in on the Facebook Supreme Court meetings, you mentioned that a lot of the debates mimicked the division that we see on the US Supreme Court, with some people leaning towards a, quote, textualist interpretation of the policies and others favoring a living interpretation. In your opinion, what do you think is the best way to interpret Facebook's policies in the years ahead? And do you think that will be embraced?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not quite sure whether or not that this is going to have this exact kind of replication of something like the Supreme Court. I don't think it is. I think that just at scale, we're going to have, this problem is not kind of going to be answerable in this way. But what I do think it's part of is the beginning of kind of a general, as I said before, kind of, I think the only way forward in these organizations is not to hand the reins over to government necessarily to make any of these decisions. I think that way lies danger. But I do think that kind of building the democratic principles and democratic structures of accountability, transparency, et cetera, like into these corporations in some way, and the fact that law might enable us to do that is basically the best way forward. And to that extent, I think that the oversight board is a step in that direction. And also, we just had no idea what it was going to be, and we don't know what future ones are going to look like going forward. I mean, I think all of us as study institutions know that they are, and I mean, we've also just learned this the last 4 years, that it is a very much like the people who are in the positions of power just as much as are just as much a part of kind of how good or how effective an institution can be, or how bad it can be, depending, you know, that they're constrained by the laws, but they're not necessarily the laws don't necessarily aren't enough to basically construct the institution and all of its effects at the end of the day. And so, I don't know what's going to happen as this kind of goes forward, but it's a great question. And it's also like an amazing area to be going into if this is something that you're interested in. This is just an exploding field right now. And people cannot hire fast enough, and there cannot be enough researchers doing this work. So.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll hand it over to Marissa for our final section.
All right, so we've talked a lot about disinformation, misinformation, policies relating to it, potential effects, targeting, but we want to talk about the future, so looking ahead. So my first question, I'm opening up to Kate, Brendan, or Magdalena. What factors of the current media landscape give you hope? What, if anything, seems generally democratizing about the internet 20 years plus and on?
Deafening silence. All right. Well, look, I mean, I don't think anyone here is saying that there's clear net positive, right? All new technologies, there's pros and cons. Obviously, the internet has given voice to many groups that were not part of the conversation before. And I think that's something that lots of us appreciate. Part of what feels cacophonous, people have been making this point online recently. I think it's important. Part of what feels cacophonous about online debate is the voices that were previously not heard. Now, I don't want to suggest that people who are heard online are representative, because they are in no way are. So many more people are opting out of participating in those debates. So I don't want to take what's out there as at all representative of anyone, but there are different kinds of voices that are part of that debate. And I think that is a real positive we should celebrate. And the best information is incredible. The thing that we've learned, though, painfully over years, is just how vast a gap can be between the best information available and what people actually consume in their everyday lives, right? I'm from the generation where when people got an encyclopedia on a CD-ROM and put it into their computer, that was like this magical access to information that people had never had before. And now here we are, and it's the amount of information, high quality, incredible information that's never been available, is unmatched in human history. But human beings remain human beings, and kind of our simplistic notions about how people should consume information and what they should spend their time doing have just been falsified again and again. And we're going to have to think about policies that are based on realistic understandings of human psychology and human society.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to add to that from the panel? Deafening silence again. All right, so in the interest of time, I want to ask my last question and then also leave it open for some final remarks and comments. So Shannon and Yunkang, what do you think journalists, students of democratic erosion, or citizens more broadly should be focusing on with respect to disinformation as a threat to the democracy today?
I'll just say one thing super briefly, and then kick it over to Yunkang. I think that we started in the beginning, Brendan, talking about the history of fact checking and all of this, and what I would love, and I wish there was a move more towards, and I think we see it a little bit sometimes, especially in sort of the moments of rupture, like right after January 6th, is journalists, instead of fact checking, were sort of like democracy checking, right? And they were like blatantly calling out like, this is anti-democratic, right? It's sort of gone away like pretty quickly. Now we're back into like the usual game frame of like, well, this new voting bill is good for Republicans and bad for Democrats. But what I would love to instead see that story be is like, this voting bill is bad for Americans and bad for democracy because it limits access to the ballot box in a way that is fundamentally opposed to democracy, period. Here's who's responsible for it. That's it, right? And so that is, if I could wave a magic wand and change the way that journalists frame the many things going on in our society, I would put a democratic check sort of above a fact check in terms of the importance of it in this particular moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the problem of disinformation is rooted in the disconnect between citizens and democratic institutions that supposedly to work for them. And many people, they lost trust in the government, in news organizations, in higher education, because they don't believe that these institutions are operating in their interests. This makes them vulnerable to disinformation that exploits their distrust and their discontent. And I think to restore their trust, these institutions must do a better job representing people's interests in a multiracial democracy. I think fact-checking, media literacy, platform regulation, all can help. But I think fundamentally, it is incumbent on democratic institutions to do a better job to serve the needs of a multiracial democracy.
I just want to follow up into Shannon's point and kind of emphasize this again. One of the things that I also see happening, kind of sounds super cynical and maybe counterintuitive, but there has been this immense amount of performance that like has started to really emerge that I do think is love to see more of the performance around kind of performance for votes and the performance by politicians for fundraising, and using completely worthless legislation that they know will not ever be voted on or be successful or make anything better or solve the problems that they're ostensibly trying to solve, but they nonetheless know that they can like look like they're, they can make a floor speech about it, clip it, ironically post it on Twitter and Facebook and all of these other sites, and then say that they're trying to curb and kind of break the back of big tech. And it's all just kind of a giant like bullshit like scheme. And I'm really like, I think that is actually one of the worst things that's happening right now. And I would love to have kind of a more meta conversation about how maybe closing certain types of transparency, things like floor speeches, things like C-SPAN to the public would maybe go very far in kind of like in curbing that type of thing and bringing some thoughtful deliberation back to legislatures.
All right, thank you. I will pass it to Rob to wrap it up for us.
Okay, I don't have really much to add beyond all the extraordinary insights that you guys shared with us today. This was really just such a terrific panel, and what a treat to get to hear from folks from such different disciplines. That's something, at least in political science, that's something I don't usually get to do. So I think that the conversation was really truly enriched by having all those different perspectives. So thanks so much to Liz and Marissa for moderating. Thanks to all of the panelists for sharing your insights with us, and thanks to everyone in the audience for coming and being here. We're really grateful that you could be part of this event, and I hope you'll keep an eye out for future democratic erosion roundtables. This certainly won't be the last.